On an ordinary January evening in 2018, 3-year-old Lexi ran laughing toward the front door of her home in Rugby, her baby sister and her mother only steps behind her. A security camera caught the whole thing, a small child full of motion and noise, doing nothing more remarkable than coming home after a day out. There was no warning in that footage, no shadow over it, just a little girl who was happy. Within 7 hours, Lexi would be dead. And 18 days after that, the world would learn that her death was not the end of this story. It was only the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases Britain had seen in years. Her name was Lexi Draper. She was 3 years old and she lived in Rugby, a market town in Warwickshire, England, a place of around 80,000 people, best known for giving its name to the sport invented there nearly 2 centuries ago. It is the kind of town where most lives unfold quietly, far from headlines. Lexi's was supposed to be one of them. She was the first child of a young mother named Louise Porton, who had given birth to her at just 18. In those early days, Lexi had a father in her life too, Chris Draper, Louise's partner at the time. The little family was young and the circumstances were uncertain, the way they often are for very young parents, but Lexi was loved. And before long, she became something even bigger than somebody's daughter. She became a big sister. Her sister arrived a short while later. Scarlett Vaughn, 17 months old at the time these events would unfold. 2 little girls, close in age, sharing a home and a mother in the small, ordinary world that small children build for themselves out of toys and routines and the faces they see every morning. Scarlett was barely more than a baby, still in that stage of life that is almost entirely trust that the adults around her would feed her, warm her, and keep her safe. She had no way of knowing anything else. Children that age never do. What we know of these 2 girls is, heartbreakingly, mostly what others knew of them from the outside. They were too young to leave behind diaries, friendships, ambitions, or the trail of small choices that usually lets a documentary reconstruct a life. Lexi was 3, Scarlett was a toddler. Their world was the size of a flat and a few familiar streets, but the people who saw them described 2 ordinary, lively little girls. In the surviving footage from their final day together, Lexi appears chatty and bright, running ahead with the fearless energy of a child who feels completely safe. Scarlett toddles in behind her. To anyone watching that clip without knowing what came next, it would look like nothing more than the end of a normal family afternoon. By early 2018, the girls were living with their mother at a flat in Beechwood Court in Rugby. They had not always lived there. For a stretch between 2016 and 2017, the family had been based at an address in Willenhall near Walsall, before Louise moved them to Rugby and began a new chapter of her life. That move would later take on a darker significance, because it coincided with Louise cutting off contact between the children and Chris Draper. He would never meet Scarlett at all. In the months and years that followed, that absence, those special occasions a father never got to share, would become one of the most painful threads in the entire case. But in early 2018, all of that was still ahead. This was the world Lexi and Scarlett lived in. A small flat, a young single mother, and the ordinary precariousness of a family on a low income. Louise worked part-time as a model and supported the household however she could. Being a young single parent of 2 small children is hard at the best of times, and by various accounts there were people in Louise's life, her sister, other family members, who helped care for the girls when she could not. On the surface, it was the kind of struggling but getting by family situation that exists on countless streets in countless towns. Nothing about it announced what was coming. And that is part of what makes this case so difficult to sit with. Most true crime stories give you a moment to brace yourself, a sinister stranger, a clear threat, a danger you can see approaching from a distance. Here there was none of that. The danger to Lexi and Scarlett did not come from outside their home. It did not lurk in the streets of Rugby or wait for them in the dark. The people who loved these girls had no reason at the start of 2018 to believe they were anything other than safe. On the afternoon of 14 January 2018, the small family did something completely unremarkable. Louise took Lexi and Scarlett out, reportedly accompanied by a relative, to a family restaurant in Rugby, the sort of place with a soft play corner and chicken nuggets and high chairs, where families go precisely because it is easy and ordinary. They ate. They spent the afternoon together. And in the early evening, around 7 o'clock, they came home. It is that homecoming that the security camera at Beechwood Court captured. The last footage of Lexi and Scarlett alive and together. Lexi running toward the door full of life, Scarlett following, their mother behind them. A few seconds of film that mean nothing on their own and everything once you know what they sit at the edge of. Because in that moment, on that evening, Lexi Draper had only hours left. Not days, not weeks, hours, and her little sister Scarlett, who toddled in behind her that night, had less than 3 weeks of her own. Nobody watching that footage in real time could have known it. The neighbors didn't know. The relatives who had spent the afternoon with them didn't know. The 2 little girls themselves, climbing the steps to their own front door, certainly didn't know. The evening would end the way ordinary evenings end: baths, bedtime, the small rituals of a household with young children winding down towards sleep. But somewhere in the hours after those cameras stopped recording, in the quiet of that flat in Rugby, something happened that no post-mortem, no trial, and no judge would ever be able to fully explain. Something that would leave investigators staring at the bodies of two children and unable, at first, to find a single natural reason for either of them to have died. The next time anyone outside that flat saw Lexi, it would not be on a security camera, it would be the paramedics, and by then it would already be far too late. The most frightening thing about the woman at the center of this case is not what was wrong with her. It is that on paper nothing was. There was no diagnosis to point to, no history of violence flagged in a file, no moment where a doctor or a court had looked at her and seen a danger. When it was all over, the judge who sentenced her would say plainly that Louise Porton had no medical history and no mental disorder that went any way toward explaining what she had done. That absence, that void where an explanation should be, is the shadow that hangs over everything that follows. Louise Porton was born in 1996. By the time of the events in this case, she was just 22 years old. She came from the West Midlands, and before moving to Rugby, she had lived for a stretch in Willenhall, near Walsall, an ordinary working-class town in the heart of England. She had become a mother very young, giving birth to Lexi at 18. To the people around her, she was a young single mum trying to get by, doing part-time modeling work and raising two little girls largely on her own. From the outside, hers looked like one of countless young lives stretched thin by money worries and the relentless demands of small children. But the picture that would later emerge from the courtroom was of a woman leading two lives that pulled hard against each other. Alongside the modeling, Louise spent a great deal of time on dating apps, and the court heard, offered men sexual services in exchange for money, sometimes for sums as small as £30. This was the lifestyle that prosecutors would point to again and again, not to shame her for sex work, but because of how it sat against the timeline of her daughter's deaths. The suggestion at trial was stark, that her children had come to feel to her like a burden, something in the way. The clearest documented warning sign came not from a psychiatrist but from a landlady. Between roughly August 2016 and November 2017, before the move to Rugby, Louise and the girls lived at an address in Willenhall. The woman who owned that property would later testify that she had ended up spending more and more of her own time caring for the children, because Louise so often did not. According to her account, Louise would do whatever she could to avoid having the girls with her. She described a young mother who grew frustrated and irritable with her own children, who swore at them, who treated them less like daughters and more like obstacles. It was the testimony of someone who had watched up close, a kind of slow emotional withdrawal, a parent pulling away from the children who depended on her completely. It is important to be careful here. We do not have a documented record of Louise Porton's own childhood, no proven account of abuse, neglect, or trauma that the courts accepted as part of her story. True crime so often reaches for that explanation, the wound that supposedly made the monster. In this case, the honest answer is that the public record does not provide one, and the court explicitly rejected the idea that any mental illness lay behind her actions. What we are left with is not a tidy origin story, but something colder and harder to hold. A woman who appeared to almost everyone entirely normal. That ordinariness is exactly what allowed the danger to go unseen. Neighbors saw a young mum, men she messaged online saw a flirtatious stranger, family members saw someone they loved. There was no obvious menace, no public cruelty that would have set off alarms loud enough to be acted upon, and yet reportedly alarms were quietly being raised. Louise's own mother, Sharon, would later claim that multiple people had contacted social services in the period before the girls died, and that nothing had been done. Whether or not every detail of that account is precise, the broader tragedy stands. The warning signs that did exist were diffuse, scattered, and never assembled into a picture clear enough to save two children in time. Louise's relationship with her own mother was, by Sharon's own description, deeply troubled. After the conviction, Sharon spoke publicly in raw, devastated terms. She said that something had snapped in her daughter's head, that the young woman she had raised had become a monster, and that she could no longer consider Louise her daughter at all. She said the loving girl she remembered was simply gone. These are the words of a grieving, estranged mother rather than a clinical assessment, but they capture the bewilderment that would come to define this entire case. Even those closest to Louise could not understand what she had become. Sharon would also make a chilling claim, given in an interview to a national newspaper after the trial, that following Lexi's death, Louise had said something to the effect that Scarlett will be next. Sharon described those words as threatening and believed her daughter had already been planning the second death. This is Sharon's account, not something proven in court as a stated confession, but it would haunt the family because of what actually happened next. Because by mid-January 2018, the shadow was already closing in. The events were not building toward a single dramatic confrontation, the way a stranger danger story does. The threat to Lexi and Scarlett lived in the same flat as they did. It tucked them in at night. It was the one adult in the world they were supposed to be able to trust without question. In the first days of January, Lexi began to suffer mysterious episodes. On 2 January, she was rushed to hospital struggling to breathe. Doctors thought it might be a chest infection and sent her home. On 4 January, it happened again, far worse. A paramedic who treated her said he had no idea why a child would be that ill, and her life was saved only by emergency resuscitation. To the medical staff, these looked like a frightening run of bad luck for a sick little girl. In hindsight, prosecutors would argue they were something else entirely, early attempts on Lexi's life failing only because help arrived in time. And in the gaps between those hospital visits while her 3-year-old lay critically ill, Louise's other life carried on with a coldness that would later stun the courtroom. She took intimate photographs of herself in hospital toilets. She messaged men. She arranged, the court heard, to perform sex acts for money, all while Lexi fought to breathe just yards away. The shadow was no longer hypothetical. It was inside the home, moving through the ordinary rhythms of a young family. And on the evening of 14 January, after a normal day out, that home swallowed 2 little girls whole, and only one of the 3 people who walked through the door that night would survive what came after dark. It began, as the worst things often do, looking like an accident. On 2 January 2018, 3-year-old Lexi was rushed to hospital. She was struggling to breathe. The doctors who examined her could find nothing alarming enough to keep her. They suspected a chest infection, gave antibiotics, and sent her home. To everyone involved, it was a sick child having a rough start to the year. 2 days later, on 4 January, it happened again, and this time it was far worse. Paramedics were called to a flat on Park Road in Rugby. One of them, David Woods Thomas, would later tell a court that he had no idea why a child could be that ill. Lexi was lying flat on her back. Her condition critical. Her life was saved that day only by the skill of the paramedics who resuscitated her. Again, doctors searched for a cause. Again, they settled on a chest infection. And again, once she was stable, Lexi was discharged. What no one watching knew was what was happening in the spaces around those hospital visits. While Lexi lay critically ill, her mother's other life did not pause. The court would later hear that Louise had taken intimate photographs of herself in the hospital toilets and exchanged messages with men, including arranging to perform sex acts for money, all while her 3-year-old fought to breathe nearby. And in the days after Lexi came home on 4 January, someone in that household began typing a series of questions into a search engine that no innocent explanation has ever covered. Questions about whether a person could die if their nose was blocked and their mouth covered with tape, about how long after drowning a body could still be revived, about why a 3-year-old would stop breathing at all. Then came 14 January, a Sunday, and on its surface, a good day. Louise took Lexi and Scarlett out, reportedly with a relative, to a Brewers Fayre family restaurant in Rugby. It was the most ordinary outing imaginable, a meal out with 2 little kids. They came home around 7 in the evening. And it was there, at Beechwood Court, that a security camera captured the footage that the world would later see. Lexi running ahead toward the door, full of life and noise, Scarlett toddling behind, their mother following them in. The last moving images of 2 sisters alive together. Watching it cold, you would see nothing but a family ending a normal weekend. Later that night, around 11, the household's phone activity told a very different story. Among the websites visited were searches about what happens to a body after death, including how long it takes a body to go cold. These were not the searches of a worried parent looking up a fever. They were the searches of someone thinking about the aftermath of dying. In the early hours of 15 January, a 999 call was placed. Lexi was not breathing. When the call handler asked, the answer came back flatly no. Paramedics arrived at the flat just 9 minutes later. The property was noticeably cold. Lexi was on the floor by the bed. A paramedic named Mark tried to open her airway, but her jaw was already stiff. Rigor mortis had begun to set in. Her skin was pale and mottled, her lips blue. He knew at once that there was nothing to be done, that this little girl had not just stopped breathing but had been gone for some time. Her time of death was recorded at around 12:50. Louise's account was that she had put Lexi in the bath earlier and later found her unresponsive in bed. When the paramedic gently told Louise that Lexi had died, she burst into tears, but he would later recall that she cried for less than a minute before walking out of the bedroom. Lexi was wrapped in blankets and carried out to the ambulance, then driven to University Hospital Coventry. Because a young child had died suddenly and without explanation, the formal procedures for the unexpected death of a child were triggered. A post-mortem would follow. And crucially, the doctors who performed it could find no natural reason for Lexi to have died. What happened in the days after Lexi's death would, in time, do more to damn Louise Porton than anything else. The very next day she accepted dozens of friend requests on a dating app and resumed messaging men. She told one that her little girl had passed away the day before. When he offered his sympathy, her reply was simply that it was all right. She arranged to meet a man. When she went to a funeral parlor to plan Lexi's service, staff were struck by her demeanor. She was reportedly heard laughing and was seen on a video call with a man. A young mother who had just lost her firstborn was behaving as though almost nothing had happened. And then, 18 days after Lexi died, it happened to Scarlett. By late January, Louise and Scarlett had moved into a hotel in Rugby. On 1 February, Louise was seen driving around the town along several roads, stopping at a petrol station to fill up her car. CCTV captured her calmly putting fuel in the car. The evidence would later indicate that, by this point, 17-month-old Scarlett was already dead or dying in the back seat. Around this time, Louise messaged a man named Patrick on WhatsApp, asking him to send her £30 for fuel so she could, she said, get Scarlett to hospital, insisting she was not going to lose another baby. Patrick urged her to call an ambulance immediately and not waste any time. What Louise did instead was call 111, the non-emergency line, rather than 999. She said Scarlett was in her car seat and not breathing and that she could not wake her. She would later say the situation had not seemed urgent. When paramedics reached the toddler, they found every emergency responder's worst nightmare: a baby who was freezing, completely lifeless, and who had clearly been dead for some time. Asked what had happened, Louise said Scarlett had been diagnosed with flu and that her older sister had died 2 weeks before. She was, witnesses said, calm, emotionless. Now both of her daughters were dead, 18 days apart, and there was still no natural explanation for either of them. That was the moment the story stopped being a tragedy and started becoming an investigation. 1 unexplained child death is a heartbreak. 2 in the same family within 3 weeks, with doctors unable to find a single natural cause for either. That is something else. The coincidence was simply too monstrous to accept. Quietly, investigators began to look not at what had killed these children, but at who. And when the post-mortem results finally came back, they would confirm the unthinkable and turn every cold, careless thing Louise Porton had done into evidence. When the post-mortem results came back, they confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved. Lexi and Scarlett had not died of any natural illness. Both deaths were consistent with airway obstruction, possibly suffocation, and there was more. Both girls were found to have prior injuries, the kind that suggested they had been physically harmed before the days they died. In Scarlett's case, there were signs of previous airway obstruction and bleeding in the tissue of her neck, indicating that significant pressure had been applied. These were not the bodies of children who had simply fallen ill. They were the bodies of children who had been hurt more than once by someone. That someone could realistically only be one person. On March 2018, Louise Porton was arrested on suspicion of murdering both of her daughters. It was, in one sense, a shocking moment. She had only one prior conviction on her record from when she was 15 for wasting police time. There was nothing in her history that screamed killer, but the evidence was no longer about her history. It was about the 18 days in early 2018 and the digital trail she had left across them. She denied any wrongdoing, insisting she had no idea why her children had died, and was released while detectives kept building their case. And build it they did. The investigation pulled together a portrait so damning that, laid out in full, it left little room for doubt. Police seized Louise's phone, and what they recovered turned her own carelessness into a confession of sorts. There were the searches, the questions about blocking a nose and covering a mouth, about reviving someone after drowning, about how long it takes a body to go cold. There were the messages. Just 1 day before Lexi died, Louise had written to a man that she was having a hard time because her 3-year-old was gravely ill with a deadly flu and that doctors had told her the girl was going to die. No doctor had said any such thing. She appeared to be laying groundwork, building a story of a sick child days before that child stopped breathing. The same pattern repeated with Scarlett. In the period before the toddler's death, Louise told people she was frightened she would lose her too. But CCTV from the hotel where they were staying showed a Scarlett who looked perfectly well, happy, healthy, alive. The fear Louise was broadcasting to others did not match the child the cameras captured. It matched, instead, the death she would shortly report. Detectives also tracked down the people who had known Louise as a mother before any of this happened. Her former landlady in Willenhall described a woman who avoided her own children whenever she could, who grew irritable and short with them, who saw them as a burden rather than a joy. Former friends spoke of a mother who routinely left her daughters with family so she could go out. Piece by piece, the investigation assembled a picture of a parent who had emotionally checked out of her children's lives long before she ended them. And running underneath it all was the motive prosecutors would eventually put to a jury, that Lexi and Scarlett had simply gotten in the way of the life their mother wanted to live. In January 2019, a year after Lexi's death, the Crown Prosecution Service approved 2 charges of murder. Louise appeared before magistrates at Leamington Spa, speaking only to confirm her basic details. She denied the charges. In a prepared statement, she insisted her children had never been an inconvenience, that she had built her life around them, and that she still did not know how they had died, flatly rejecting any suggestion that she had used their illness or deaths to make money. The case was sent to Crown Court. In July 2019, the trial opened at Birmingham Crown Court. It would run for around 5 weeks before a jury of 10 men and 2 women. Prosecutor Oliver Saxby QC laid out the case methodically: 2 children dead 18 days apart, both consistent with deliberate airway obstruction, with doctors unable to find a single natural reason for either death. The overwhelming inference, he argued, was that someone had deliberately interfered with the girls' breathing and that someone could only be their mother. The jury heard the searches read aloud. They heard about the topless photos taken while Lexi lay critically ill, the sex acts offered for money, the dozens of friend requests accepted the day after Lexi died, the laughter at the funeral parlor, the call to a non-emergency line while Scarlett lay dead in a car seat. Louise's defense was that she loved her daughters and had nothing to do with their deaths. From the witness stand, she said the girls had always made her laugh, that she had tried to give them everything. She told the court she struggled to form emotional attachments and to express her feelings, but there was no evidence of any medical or psychological condition that could account for what she was accused of doing. The contrast the jury was left with was brutal. A woman describing maternal love set against a record of cold indifference written in her own searches and messages. On 1 August 2019, after roughly 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Unanimously, they found Louise Porton guilty of 2 counts of murder. The following day, 2 August, she was sentenced. Mrs. Justice Amanda Yip described the killings as evil and calculated. She told Louise that one way or another she had squeezed the life out of each of her daughters, only calling for help once she knew they were already dead. The judge noted there was no medical history or mental disorder that went any way toward explaining the case, and that these had been blameless, vulnerable young children who should have been able to rely on their mother to protect them. Instead, the judge said, Louise had taken their lives away. The sentence was life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 32 years before she could even be considered for parole. Throughout the verdict and sentencing, Louise showed almost nothing. She sat with her head in her hands, staring down, betraying no visible emotion, the same flat detachment that had marked her behavior from the very first 999 call. The man who felt the loss most deeply was not even in the room in the way a father should have been allowed to be. Chris Draper, Lexi's father, who had never been permitted to meet Scarlett at all, gave a victim impact statement that cut to the bone. He spoke of being broken, of taking each day at a time, of asking again and again how a mother could do something so evil to her own children. He said he would always wonder whether, if the right people had listened sooner, his daughters might still be alive. Justice of a kind had been done, but justice does not bring children back, and for the people Lexi and Scarlett left behind, the hardest part was only just beginning. Heart that lasts, not the searches, not the cold indifference, not the headlines about a monster mum, but the 2 children at the center of it. Their names were Lexi and Scarlett. They were 3 years old and 17 months old. They were sisters and they were loved, and they deserved a whole lifetime together. The world is a smaller, dimmer place without them in it, and they will never, ever be forgot.